Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I just got the Anbernic RG34XXSP in the mail. Let's take a look at it. This is a clamshell handheld very similar to the RG35XXSP that came out last year, but this one has a different screen. So this is a 3.4-inch 3:2 aspect ratio display. This makes it a perfect fit for Game Boy Advance games which had this exact aspect ratio. In fact, this is a 3x integer scale of that old console. But there are some weird aspects to this which I want to talk about in this video today. This is not a full-on review. I just got it in the mail, so this is more like impressions and thoughts. We've got a lot to talk about, so grab your favorite snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we get started, this is a review unit sent over from Anbernic, but not directly to me. So they've been changing up their shipping methods over the past few weeks because of the US tariff situation. And one of the providers that they chose, at least at the time of launching this device, did not ship to Hawaii. And so I had no means of actually getting it sent to me. But instead, one other reviewer, Bill over at Nerd Nest, he got this in the mail the other day and he said, you know what, I don't have time to make a review right now. How about I just send it over to Russ? And so that was super awesome of him. Thank you, Bill, for sending this over. I do expect to get other devices in the mail as well. I think that Stubbs over at Retro Handheld sent me over a couple today, and I think Anbernic is still trying to send me some directly. So it may be that I'm swimming in this device in about 2 weeks from now. Either way, like with all my reviews, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Let's jump in by talking about the specs and whatnot for this device. The RG34XXSP launched about a week ago, and it's currently for sale for $67 before shipping and taxes. It also comes in 4 different color options. We have yellow, gray, black, and indigo. And the specs here are very similar to other Anbernic RGXX devices, including the fact that it's running that H700 chipset, which we've seen in about 8 other handhelds at this point. One thing that is unique is that it has 2 GB of RAM, which is double the others in the XX line. Now, when it comes to emulating games, having additional RAM doesn't really make that big of a difference. So the difference between 1 and 2 gigs is not going to really change the way that certain systems work. Instead, that extra headroom is going to help when using a tool called Portmaster, which allows you to play PC ports. I made a video about Portmaster and all the things you can do with it. You can play over 1,000 games that way. I will leave it linked down below. Some other aspects worth noting, this device does have video out via HDMI. This is a mini HDMI plug. And it is also capable of 5 GHz Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 4.2. Now, the thing about the RG34XXSP is that it's an update of the RG35XXSP. I'm just going to call these the 3.4 and 3.5 from now on. And the number indicates the size of the screen. On the original one, it is a 3.5-inch 4:3 aspect ratio display. And this one has a standard 640 by 480 resolution, which we've seen in a lot of other handhelds over the years. Now, the 3.4 has a 3.4-inch display instead, and a different aspect ratio. This one is 3:2. This one also has a higher resolution, 720 by 480, which makes it a 3x integer scale of the original Game Boy Advance. And it is worth noting that both of these devices have the same H700 chipset inside, so performance and custom firmwares are going to be relatively the same. It's also not the first Anbernic device with the same screen. This is the RG34XX non-SP. This one has the exact same screen as well, 3.4 inches and a 3x integer scale of Game Boy Advance. And so the idea here is that both of these devices are suited for playing original Game Boy Advance games because the aspect ratio and resolution are such a good fit. And of course, the design is modeled after the original Game Boy Advance and the GBA-SP. When the 3.5 first came out, there were some people who didn't like the fact that it was a 4:3 aspect ratio. They expected that because it looked like a GBA-SP, that it would have a 3:2 aspect ratio to make it a perfect Game Boy Advance handheld. Now, personally, I liked that this device had a 4:3 aspect ratio display because that means that I could play all sorts of systems on it. 4:3 is a pretty good catch-all for both home console systems as well as handheld systems, so I really didn't mind the fact that it wasn't a perfect GBA match. And that's where the 3.4 is going to excel, but this screen is also a hindrance for the other systems. We'll talk about that later. The other big change between the two is that the new 3.4 is actually a lot smaller than the original 3.5. When you compare the 3.5 to an actual GBA-SP shell, you can see that, yeah, it's quite a bit wider and also thicker. And so even though it kind of looks the same size on camera, it makes a world of difference in your pocket. And so this one has always been a little bit of a chunky boy. But when you compare the new 3.4 against the SP, they're almost the exact same size. Now, the batteries on my calipers died, so I'm not able to get an exact configuration right now. But yes, just in terms of width and height, it does feel the same to me. Maybe a little bit bigger on the 3.4, but it is a minuscule difference. Same thing when it comes to thickness between the two. The Anbernic is is definitely a little bit thicker than the Game Boy Advance SP shell, but it is not by much. And I think this is a great move because I always thought the 35XXSP was just a little bit too chunky. And so now it actually feels like a GBA SP. I love it. In fact, it's almost identical to the Miyoo Flip, which was one of my favorite things about this handheld as well, is that it actually is very similar to the GBA SP. So I do like the fact that we now have two different very pocketable choices. Now, from a design perspective, it feels like these three devices are very much so connected. In fact, the Miyoo Flip was announced well before even this first Anbernic came out, but it came out in between these two. And so when the Anbernic first came out, it was, obviously a lot chunkier than we were expecting. And then also it had some other issues, like the buttons initially were very hard to press down on, which they fixed with a later iteration. Later on, the Miyoo Flip came out, which was much smaller and had lighter to press down buttons and also included analog sticks. Now, these are kind of like PS Vita style sticks, so they're a little bit smaller than what you would find on a Nintendo Switch. And then we have the 34XXSP, which feels like a hybrid between the two, where they took the lessons of their own and also the lessons that they had seen about the Miyoo Flip, and then they created their own handheld, kind of to beat both of them. So this one has a very similar design to the Miyoo Flip, including like the ribbing on the back. It's almost identical between the two. And lo and behold, they also added analog sticks, which look nearly identical to the Miyoo Flip. Now, thankfully, the one design choice they did not copy from the Miyoo Flip is their original hinge, because the Miyoo Flip hinge is kind of terrible. I've made videos about this. But thankfully, the Anbernic just follows the same model as the original Game Boy Advance SP, which has the same hinge design. It worked well on the 35XXSP as well, so I'm expecting the same here. Let's quickly go around the device and also talk about controls. So here's HDMI as well as our USB port for peripherals as well as charging. We've also got shoulder and trigger buttons that are actually pretty good. They don't rattle or anything, and they are relatively quiet. You can feel that they are padded. They're not silent, but they're quieter than I've seen on other Anbernic devices. On the left side, we've got volume up and down as well as one of our micro SD card slots. On the right side, we have the other micro SD card slot. This is for additional games. Then we have our reset and power buttons. On the bottom, we've got our headphone jack, and then on the left side of that, we've got a lanyard hole. So if you wanted to actually connect this to a lanyard, you can. And then, of course, we've got this hinge, which resembles the Game Boy Advance SP. It feels pretty good. It actually just snaps to one position right here, which is your main playing position, and then also snaps more to this is like 190 degrees, a little bit more than I would like. But for the most part, you're mostly just going to be opening it to this where it snaps into place, and then you can close it up. It actually snaps down really nicely, nice and quiet. Now, as far as the buttons go, these are actually identical to what I found on the updated version of the 35XXSP. The D-pad is a little bit different of a design. You can see it's a little bit skinnier than the 35XXSP, but the face buttons themselves look to be the same, although these ones on the left are colored. One of my issues with the first 35XXSP was that the D-pad and the face buttons were too hard to press down on. They were fatiguing over time and also quite loud. Now, they did a revision of the device and added additional colors like the red transparent model, and they revised the buttons to make them a little bit softer as well as quieter, and I definitely like it better on the revision, and these ones here on the left feel exactly the same. So they have a soft dome clickiness to them, very reminiscent of the original Game Boy Advance SP, and they feel very good, very accurate and precise, and not super loud or hard to press down on. Now, I've got this very unscientific way of measuring actuation force with buttons, and what I do is I just put the device on a kitchen scale, and then I press a button and see how much force it requires to actually push the button down. And I found that on average, with these buttons in particular, it's usually around 80 or 90 in terms of actuation force. Again, it's not very scientific. I will get a variety of different readings, and it often changes from day to day. So I would say, yeah, on average, 80 to 90, let's just say 85. And yeah, to me, the 34XXSP is the exact same amount of force, usually between 80 and 90 grams. So my guess here is that whatever they did with the revision of the 3.5, they also did with the 3.4. Now, with the original Game Boy Advance SP, this still feels lighter. Like this is somewhere between like 65 and 70 grams of actuation force. And same thing with the Miyoo Flip. This one feels about 70 grams of force. And so, yeah, I would say that the GBA SP and the Miyoo Flip are still a little bit lighter, but it's no longer bad on the Anbernic one, so I still like it. So from a design perspective, it feels like Anbernic really kind of made a best of or greatest hits compilation, where they took a lot of the design choices they had in their original model, and then some of the lessons that they saw from the Miyoo Flip, then put them together themselves. However, this is also where things start to get a little bit weird. And the first thing here that really kind of struck me when I first saw this announced was the fact that they have two analog sticks on a device that has a 3:2 aspect ratio display. Like I mentioned earlier, this 3:2 aspect ratio works really well for Game Boy Advance, but doesn't work super well with other systems. Now, because it's 3.4 inches, you might first think that, hey, it's only 0.1 inches smaller than the other one, so it's really a small difference. But that's not really how things work when it comes to aspect ratios, because this is 3:2, which means it's wider, which means a larger number like that when showing 4:3 content is actually going to be quite a bit smaller. So when it comes to playing 4:3 content on this device, you're not going to get 3.4 inches. You're actually going to get 3.1. And there is quite a big difference between a 3.5 inch 4:3 display and a 3.1 inch 4:3 display. And so if you do plan on playing stuff like Super Nintendo and Genesis and PlayStation and Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast, all those systems which run pretty well on this chipset, they are all going to be 3.1 inches instead of 3.4 or even 3.5. And the part where this gets weird is that we have these two analog sticks, which are better fitting for systems like PS1, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and arcade games. All of those are going to really benefit from having analog sticks, but the screen will not. And so we're left in this weird position where screen-wise, the 3.5 is going to be a lot better fit for those 4:3 systems, but controls-wise, the 3.4 is going to be a better fit. Now, if we think about this handheld as a purely Game Boy Advance machine, something that really is going to take advantage of that 3:2 aspect ratio display, then you don't really need analog sticks either. I'm sure you already know this, but the original Game Boy Advance SP did not have analog sticks, so no games were actually made with analog sticks in mind. Now, there might be some GBA games where using an analog stick might be of benefit. For example, moving around town in Pokemon, this might feel a little bit more natural, but for the vast majority of Game Boy Advance games, I likely will just be using the D-pad and face buttons. And so for me, it does feel a little bit weird that they spent the time to design and add these analog sticks, but then use it for a screen that is going to benefit from a non-analog stick control scheme. Now, thankfully, it's actually not a big deal when playing this device. The analog sticks themselves are flush with the case, so you won't really even feel them. And when you're playing with your D-pad and face buttons, you won't even touch the analog sticks at all. So it's almost like they're not there. If anything, it just feels weird from a visual perspective that we have these sticks on the bottom, which are mostly not going to be used for the systems that you likely are going to buy this device for. And speaking of other things that look weird, let's talk about this screen, because this is just crazy. So right off the bat, you can see that they likely used a very similar design to the 3.5, but they basically just stuck that 3.4 screen inside instead. And it does look a little bit strange because we got this big old forehead here on the top. I've been calling it a 5 head because it's just so large, even compared to the bottom bezel. Now, one thing that is unique about the 3.4 design is that they covered up the black bars in the bezel with the plastic frame. You can see that on the 35XXSP, you've got black bars around the edges, whereas this one is actually covered up with the actual plastic. So this is probably one of the tricks that they use to save on size. Instead of having double bezels like on the left one, they actually just covered it up on the right. This is also similar to the Miu Flip, which used the plastic to cover the black bezel as well. And when playing Game Boy Advance games, yes, it does actually look very good. You can see that it fills up the whole screen, and this is a perfect 3x integer scale, so I do think it looks very nice. The screen also looks a little bit different from the original 3.4XX. It looks a little bit more bright and vibrant. You can see here that, yes, everything pops just a little bit more. In fact, the new one actually looks really good outdoors. Like, this is a handheld that I would love to play outside, which is not very common with some of these clamshells. They usually don't have a super bright screen, so I'm very happy to see this. And when it comes to playing Game Boy Advance games, it's a really good fit. In fact, this is probably all I'm going to do on this handheld, is make it a Game Boy Advance machine like I did with the original RG34XX, just because this screen is a perfect fit for that original handheld. And there are definitely advantages of using the 34XXSP over the 35XXSP in terms of playing Game Boy Advance. For example, in this scenario, on the right side, I'm using a combination of a shader to balance out the pixels because it's only a 480p resolution, and then I'm also using a special overlay to give it that GBA bezel look on the bottom. Meanwhile, on the left side, all I'm doing is just displaying the image itself because it's already pixel perfect in terms of integer scaling, and so I don't have to use any additional shaders. I could always add an LCD grid overlay if I would like, but in general, it already looks beautiful just like this. You can also see there's a big difference in terms of color as well. The one on the left definitely has a more vibrant screen. I think it looks beautiful. Even when playing non-Game Boy Advance content, I still think it looks really good. So this is a Super Nintendo game, and you can see that, yes, the colors are a lot more vibrant on the left side than with the 35XXSP. The big issue here is going to be the size of the screen. You can see that at 3.1 inches with 4:3 content on the left compared to a full 3.5 inches on the right, I would rather play 4:3 content on the older Anbernic. And that doesn't make the 3.4 a bad handheld. It just means that it is more focused on Game Boy Advance in particular, but even then it's not perfect in that regard with this high forehead and then also, these analog sticks which don't make a lot of sense. Now this is where things get really interesting. My buddy Carrie over at The Fox, he just released a video earlier today talking about this screen and the fact that it is not a native 3:2 aspect ratio. It's actually a 4:3 display. And he figured this out by connecting directly to the device via Linux and actually seeing what the screen was being output to and what the native device display was. And the display is reporting at a resolution of 1280 by 960, which is a 4:3 aspect ratio. I'm going to leave his video linked down below so you can dig a little bit more into it, but we've been talking about this over the past week or so because he figured this out and did a bunch of investigation and was letting me in on the whole process. Now the crazy thing is, if you take off the bezels on the screen, you can see right here that we have a lot more screen to work with. In fact, you can see that Bill actually put the 3:2 aspect ratio screen protector on there, and we've got a lot more screen to work with. Now, some of this could be attributed to being actual bezels on the display itself that are covered by the plastic, but this top one in particular is way too high. So what I think they did right here is they took a 4:3 panel, they actually made it 3:2 in the software, and then they pushed the image down, and then that's why we have that big old 5 head up top. Now, you may have already heard that this happened with another device called the Retroid Pocket Mini, where they had a taller aspect ratio display, and then they squished it down to 4:3 and covered up the bezels, but that one presented all sorts of issues when it came to scaling to that aspect ratio. The problem with the Retroid one is that they were trying to scale it to a resolution that was higher than the actual resolution of the display, and so that was causing all sorts of shimmering effects and everything else. Meanwhile, if this screen is reporting correctly, and it is 1280 by 960, but then they are scaling it to 720 by 480, then we have a bunch of extra pixels to work with, and it does seem to scale properly. And the kicker here is that I also took apart one of my Anbernic RG34XXSs, and this one also appears to have a 4:3 display. Now this device does have visible black borders around it, unlike the SP, which has these plastic parts around it instead. And so what you would expect with a screen like that is that you'll have the display itself and then a lip on each side, and that's going to be the actual bezel. And you can see the bezel here on the bottom because it's a little bit curved, so that's part of the design right here to make it look like the original Game Boy Advance. And so you can see a lip here on the bottom. That's going to be that black border, but everywhere else we don't really see it. There's a tiny bit of a lip here on the sides, but there is no lip here on the top. And so that means that the panel itself is actually taller than you may think, because this bezel part right here is more than just a lip, it's actually part of the display. Now, because I don't have my calipers, I can't make a super accurate measurement, but I can see here that it's about 3 inches on the screen right here if we don't account for the small lip on the sides, and then it is about 2¼ inches right here with the top down. And lo and behold, 3 by 2¼ is exactly a 4:3 aspect ratio. So based on the data that we have, I think that the original 34XX and the SP actually do have a 4:3 aspect ratio display underneath that has been modified to look 3:2. Now, in all fairness, the 34XX has been out for nearly 6 months at this point, and I've never seen a single complaint about the scaling. Whereas with the Retroid Pocket Mini, as soon as people started to try to use shaders, they were having all sorts of problems. So I think that at least in terms of scaling and whatnot, it's actually correct on this device in that it's not presenting any sort of visual problems. But it does leave me with some questions. The first being that, okay, I get it with a 34XX. Like, it makes sense to make this a 3:2 aspect ratio display. After all, this thing looks and feels like a Game Boy Advance, so it really should play Game Boy Advance well. But with a device like the 34XXSP, I don't understand why they didn't actually just make this a 4:3 display. I get that, yes, they wanted to make it 3:2 for Game Boy Advance, but if the actual resolution is 1280 by 960, I would love to have that with a 4:3 aspect ratio. That would give us really good scaling for Game Boy Advance, but also all those other 4:3 systems would look perfect on here as well. So again, this device seems very weird to me. Not only did they put sticks on a handheld that uses a 3:2 aspect ratio display, but they also have a 4:3 aspect ratio 3.5-inch display with a super high resolution embedded inside of this device, and they covered it up to make it 3:2. And the very act of covering it up gave us this very large bezel here on the top, which is again something that looks a bit like an eyesore. And if you want to learn more about the screen, I'm going to leave that Fox video down below. It is definitely worth watching because he did some pretty crazy investigative work to find this all out. I also did a quick teardown to check whether or not the CPU and the battery are nearby, and yes, they are right on top of each other. So similar problem that we had with the original SP in that, when this heats up, it is going to go into the battery and it might heat up the device a little bit more. Now, the maximum heat of a processor is not to the point where it's actually going to be a fire hazard with a battery or anything, but it might degrade the life of it. So something to think about is that this might have additional heat transfer and the battery might not last as long over the years to come. When it comes to the thermal transfer and whatnot, I'll have to save that for the actual review video where I can measure it with a camera and everything else. Now, in terms of charging, it does appear to be the same as other Anbernic XX devices, so it does not support fast charging. If I use like a USB-A to USB-C, 5 volts, 1.5 amps, then yes, it'll charge just fine. You can see it'll go orange right here. You can also do that with USB-C to USB-C cables as long as they also have a low wattage, so even that will work. You can see that it charges. However, if you use a fast charge plug, even though it is supposed to be smart enough to know only to give it a little bit of wattage, unfortunately, it just will not work, and so you are better off using something lower powered. Okay, I've been bouncing all over the place in this impressions video, so let's start kind of compiling all these ideas together and talk about what's good and bad so far my first day with the RG34XXSP. As always, we'll start with the good stuff, and I think number one here is the fact that it's a lot smaller than the original 35XXSP. This device is now about the same size as the Game Boy Advance SP, which makes it super pocketable and fun to play on, so I'm very happy with that. I also like that these buttons are lighter to the touch. They're about the same as the revised version of the 35XXSP, so again, no complaints there. I think it feels really good to play. We'll do a lot more testing in the actual review when it comes to playing games and how that feels, but right now I don't have any sort of issues. I also think that the screen is very good for Game Boy Advance. It looks super sharp and clear. We've got a 3x integer scale, and the colors are nice and rich, and it also gets very bright. Again, I'll do some more in-depth testing in the actual review, but so far I am impressed. I also appreciate that they used the same hinge as their last model because it's a solid hinge. Some of the transparent models had some issues with cracking because they were a little bit more brittle, but other than that, it's been pretty solid for me. I also like the fact that they made yet another H700 device because that means we can take advantage of all these software options that we have for this chipset. For example, right off the bat, I was able to use my Newly SD card from my RG34XX directly into this device, and I was able to get into this software right here. And so this is pretty awesome that we're able to use custom software options on day one. Now, you knew this was coming, but I do have some bad impressions of this device as well. Let's start with the fact that the screen is just a little bit odd looking on the device. From a physical perspective, it is strange that we have that big old forehead at the top of it. It just looks a little bit odd to me. I'm also very confused about this screen in the first place. I'm not sure what's going on here, but all signs are pointing to the fact that this is probably a 4:3 aspect ratio screen, and they covered up some of those bezels and rescaled it so that it would work better for Game Boy Advance. And it does leave me confused as to why they just didn't go with a revised model of a 3.5-inch 4:3 display. There are also other weird design choices, like the fact that we have analog sticks on a device that seemingly is designed for Game Boy Advance, a system that doesn't really use analog sticks. So at the end of the day, I'm a little bit confused and somewhat unsatisfied with the RG34XXSP. I feel like Anbernic could have gone two different routes. They could have made a Game Boy Advance-centric handheld that had a 3:2 aspect ratio display like this one, but maybe taking out the sticks to make it a more focused approach. And at the same time, I would have loved to have seen a device very similar to this, same size, same sticks and everything else, but with a proper 4:3 3.5-inch display. That essentially would have been a superior version to the Miu Flip, which has that 4:3 aspect ratio display and a very similar size and controller layout. But the problem with the Flip is that it has a very unstable hinge and also does not have a lot of software support, two things that the Anbernic does have. And so I am left unsatisfied with this device, which feels like it's very close to being an ultimate Game Boy Advance SP with that GBA style screen, but then also has a design choice that makes it a good all-around device if it wasn't for that GBA screen. At the end of the day, it does feel like the RG34XXSP has a bit of an identity crisis. It doesn't really know what it wants to be. What I'd really love to see is a device exactly like this, but with a 3.5-inch 4:3 display. That allows me to take advantage of these additional analog sticks which they've added, and I think that would be just a really good all-around handheld and probably become my favorite clamshell in that regard. But as it stands right now, when we have so many other options on the market between other clamshells and just other handhelds, this one does feel like it missed the mark. It was very close, but there's just a couple things missing. You may already know this, but there's a conspiracy theory out there that these handheld companies know exactly what they're doing, that they are making a device that is nearly perfect and then they mess it up in just one small way. That way you are still having to look for the next one and hoping that they fix those mistakes, but then when they do fix them, they add something else in there to keep you buying and buying. Now, personally, I don't really put a lot of stock in this conspiracy theory. I think that humans are humans and they make mistakes, and, design teams and whatnot often have to make compromises, and it's never going to be perfect. But I don't know, after this device right here, I'm starting to feel like I need to get fitted for a tinfoil hat because it's starting to make sense. Either way, let me know what you think of these impressions in the comments down below. I will make a full review video later on, but I wanted to get some of these thoughts out there right now. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.